is that the Jews are not real human beings. They need to, they could be exterminated, they will be fine, will be good. So that's the Hermeneutic theory. The Hermeneutic theory has been, this is now completely discredited by scholars, like not myself, I'm not a specialist, but the next slide. Now, well, that's more basic what I said. You can go to the next, yeah. Now, just you could ask her, what is that thing of Hutu and Tutsi? What is it really? So historians have done a lot of work based on oral traditions, and I have a lot of respect for Emmanuel Tezimana. He died actually in 1994 at the time of the genocide, but there are many others. But I'm influenced by his work. It's true that, and I've seen document myself from the 19th century, the word Tutsi and Hutu was used in the 19th century, and probably before. We don't have text before. It's not that they want nothing. It's a bit. You need to understand. An ethnic identity is constructed over time. For example, now the Zulu people said, "I'm Zulu." Me, because I was born in Belgium, I'm Walloon, because I speak French. I'm Walloon. Now that sort of identity has a history, has a date of birth, has an evolution. So this idea, I am Zulu, I'm French, I'm Tutsi, comes over time. It's built up over time. And there are lots of political factors behind that and cultural factors. So that's what happened with the Hutu and the Tutsi. But until even independence, it was not rigid. It's the colonial government, the missionaries, and a certain number of politicians which made it rigid and very strict, if you like. You're Hutu on one side and Tutsi on the other side. It was for a long time very fluid and determined by socioeconomic factors. The sort of people close to the environment of the Mwami, the king, were said to be Tutsi. Those who had more cattle, etc. It was not at all clear-cut, but the strict division between the two is a product of history. I think I'll say enough for that. The next one, yeah. Now, what has happened, and in that the colonial age and the missionaries, because they had in mind of this basic description, they were the clever and beautiful and easy to deal with black people, which are the Tutsi. They were privileged. Then came the social revolution in 1959, and the situation was turned around, and the government, first Rwandan government, took the exact opposite position and said they excluded the Tutsi and privileged the Rwanda. There's been a lot of discrimination and violence. The first massacre started actually in 1959. So this difference between Hutu and Tutsi gradually translated into a source of violence, a huge source of violence. And yeah, you can take the next one. As I said, I don't want to spend too much about it. Now I come to another part of what I want to explain, is how a certain view of history, what I call an historical narrative, can be transmitted from generation to generation. And I like the work of a specialist of memory studies, Marianne Hirsch, I don't know if you know, I recommend, who came with the concept of post-memory. It's very useful, this notion of post-memory. What is it? It's the idea that we sort of remember things that happened before we were born. To give an example, I was born in the eastern part of Belgium, and there's been two wars between the German and the French, but also the German, Belgian, French, English, etc. And the generation before me, my mother and my grandmother had suffered this invasion of the German. And the post-memory would be that me, I still remember it, even if I wasn't there. And I feel about it. It's a lot with feelings, with emotions. And I imagine all sorts of things. But in fact, luckily, because I'm a new generation and I'm actually not that much affected by this war, I'm more affected by the resistance movement, the concentration camps, because as a child I heard about it. There were family members in the concentration camp, not really family members, people close to my family. Which means when I went to Majdanek, which is a concentration camp in Poland in 1981, and then recently in Auschwitz, I had a huge amount of emotions, as if I was a victim of the Holocaust myself. That's post-memory. So we have emotions that go to something that happened before we were born. Those emotions are for good or bad. And my argument is that mass violence, especially the genocide in Tutsi, work like that. The people who perpetrated the genocide is because they had heard stories in their family from before they were born to tell them the Tutsi are the problem, we need to get rid of them. That's how it happened. That's how it happened. And I think what happened in the Holocaust at the time of Hitler, something similar happened. And I think what happens now with xenophobia in South Africa, it happens like that. Stories that are at the back of our mind and continue to influence us. The next slide. So that's what I call the lethal stereotypes. We need to be very, very careful against labeling, stereotyping. We do that all the time. It's normal to stereotype people, but it's very dangerous. And all this violence and a lot of all the Hutu are like this, all the Hutu are like this, all the Tutsi are like that. For example, there's a stereotype that the Tutsi is a liar, is deceiving people. I heard it myself. You know, be careful, you know, they look good, but in fact at the back of their mind they try to cheat you. It's a stereotype against the Tutsi, which many missionaries have developed, actually. I heard from missionaries. That's just an example. So, of course, I don't talk here about race, but obviously racism is clearly based on stereotypes. Black people are like this, white people are like this, Indian people are like this, and so on. So, if we want to be honest and respectful, we need to unpack stereotypes. Now, I'll give you some example of this post-memory of this transmission. Amélie Fauché is a good friend of mine, an anthropologist, French. She interviewed somebody, and she said in 1990, everything suddenly came back in the conversation, and you could remember not what you had lived, what the elders had said to you as a young age. So this informant put words on what happened. He said, I know I wasn't there, but I knew it. And the other one is Simon, is a media, a radio presenter, well known, Simon Bikindi. Centuries of humiliation have preceded this. I believed all of that without having lived it because I was Hutu in a Hutu family. So it's this historical narrative of the Hutu have been exploited and oppressed by the Tutsi for generation and generation. That's what actually caused the genocide. The next slide. Right. I think I will more or less be in the time. Maybe there could be some questions. Now, I would like to broaden the scope of this discussion by saying that what I described briefly in 10-15 minutes about the genocide in Tutsi in Rwanda can be applied to a number of other situations. And I just gave a list, but there could be more. The fact that a narrative about the past, a certain reconstruction of the past, determines what happens now, and sometimes in a bad way, in a violent way. So, and I will conclude, that will be the next slide, by saying something about the work of the historian to defeat that. Let's stay here. I just thought of a certain number of examples. The Holocaust this mad idea that for the German people, the Aryan people as they call themselves, to grow, to exist, they need to eliminate a sort of poison, horrible people, not even people, not the Jews. You need to get rid of them. It's called the final solution, 1941. It came gradually, but the notion of killing them all has been documented in 1941 until 1945. And so the narrative is that all our problems come because of the Jews. They are the problem. Let's get rid of them and we'll be fine. It's also called a genocide, and that's the core idea is that let's all get rid of them. The war in Ukraine, it's a different type of... I'm very touched by what happened in Ukraine because the country where I was born, Belgium, was attacked by the Germans the same way Ukraine is attacked by the Russians since 2022. There's also a dangerous narrative there that is nostalgia, actually. And President Putin is the one who is promoting this narrative, is that there was a time with the Tsars and the Soviet Union where we were powerful, influential, happy, and we dominated a vast area, which is the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, including actually Lithuania and the Baltic states, etc. Not Finland, but almost, and further east. So this idea, that's how it should be. And for Putin, he said it in public. It was a huge mistake to dismantle the Soviet Union. We should have never done that. And now we pay a big price. And he wants to recreate this empire. And he said, Ukrainians are Russians. He doesn't ask them if they want to be Russian. No, he decides they are Russians. In fact, historically, it's quite complicated. The history of Ukraine is extremely complicated. There's all sorts of ways of migration, etc. But the idea is that from outside, Putin and his regime decide they don't have no discussion, they belong to us. And if they want to interested in joining the Union, they're not allowed because they belong to us. They have nothing to do with Europe. And if they don't like it, we invade them and we kill them all. That's what they're doing one by one, including yesterday. So the narrative is that they are Russians, and that's it. There's no discussion. I see something similar, not quite as violent, but still people die. The MAGA movement, Make America Great Again. It is typically an historical narrative. It means if it's America great again because it's no longer great. Thank you, I'll be fine, yeah. Thank you for reminding me, but I'll be fine. I'm actually doing well in terms of time. So the Make America Great Again is not, and why is it no longer great? Because of foreigners, because of the migrant, because also the feminists, because of the black people who complain, because of people who talk about slavery, because of the people who keep talking about the environment, never mind that is the heat now. Before it was so good. Before we were fine. And we were like dominating the world. So the problem is the change. I mean, the topic of it. The problem is the change. So let's get rid of the change violently. And those who support MAGA, they basically want bit by bit to destroy the Constitution and introduce a sort of dictatorship to make America great again. My point here is based on a certain view of history. It's based on a historical narrative that we need to unpack. You cannot understand what's happening in the US now if you don't look at the way this historical narrative is constructed day by day. Then closer to us in xenophobia, we all know, those who are here, that it's another ideological movement. The March or Dudula, it is ideological, completely. I don't dismiss the fact that there are problems of neighborhood, some tension at the macro level between foreigners and South Africans. I don't dismiss that. But the discourse is, in a way, they also decided a final solution. Let's get rid of all of them, not one should stay. And there's a lot of hypocrisy. They pretend it's undocumented immigrants. In fact, it's all foreigners, not only the undocumented. It's actually all of them. Because when you don't speak Zulu properly, when your accent betrays you, we hit you. I know example. So it's a lie to say it's a documented foreigners. No, it's all. And it's a bit like Hitler. Let's get all of them and we'll be fine. We'll be happy. No more unemployment, no more crime, no more drugs. We'll be fine. So I see all those different movements, something a bit similar to Rwanda, although not quite as bad. Xenophobia is not a genocide. MAGA is not a genocide. The war in Ukraine is not a genocide. The Holocaust is a genocide. We need to use term properly, not mix everything. But all in common is that there's a certain historical narrative which I think bring violence. That's what my argument here. The last slide. Now let's look at things. Let's look forward. What is the way forward? What could we do to learn from those situations and avoid falling into the same trap? And let's give some of us here, our lecturers, what message to give us to the students. Some of us, our parents or grandparents, what message should we give to our children? What can we do? And I would come to 4 simple recommendations. The background of this, it was mentioned when I was introduced, is the work of the Sinon Nando Center for Oral History and Memory Work. We've done memory work for many years, particularly initially in the context of HIV/AIDS and then in a broader way. And that's my background for that. The first is that when you do history, or when you repeat an historical narrative, or when you reflect about your own history, it's important to do what I call to listen to all parties. We tend to be partisan. For example, in this country, I was in the sort of hidden way, but not completely hidden way. In the last years of apartheid, I was actually on the side of the ANC, and I'm glad I was. It was the right thing to do. But in order to know the history of this country, you cannot only listen to ANC people. You need to also listen to the IFP, whatever, the Democratic Party. You cannot do a good history by only taking one point of view. Then you start labeling people, stereotype, etc. And in the work I did in Rwanda, I tried to do that. I actually interviewed not only the survivors of the violence, the genocide, but I went to different countries in Europe to find Hutus in exile, etc. So for good history is based on a multiplicity of sources. You don't exclude a certain type of sources. Number 2, it's very important to acknowledge emotion, to validate emotion. I've used the word emotion a few times for post-memory. You need to include that in the analysis. I'm not a psychologist, but I find the word of psychologist extremely important to do history, and I'm supposed to do philosophy as well. We need, and 3 are particularly important, is fear. I think between the xenophobia movement here, between MAGA, is the fear to lose something, to be downgraded. We need to recognize that. Any violent event as a component of fear, not only the victims, of course, are terrified, scared, but even the perpetrators are afraid of something. And that's exactly what happened in Rwanda. So it's important to analyze that, not to simplify. Secondly, anger, of course. And a lot should be said of anger, but behind any form of violence is anger. And we need to deal with anger, recognize anger, name it. And a lot of psychosocial work has to be necessary to help people to say, yes, I'm angry. Most people don't know they're angry, actually. They're violent before recognizing I'm angry. They first hit without thinking because they're angry. And all the crime in this society in South Africa has a lot to do with that. But a lot of the crime is due to anger. And sadness. I included that because grief is an important component of any human societies. We're sad because of many things. And in a certain way, it undermines our ability, if it's not dealt with, it doesn't undermine our ability to deal rationally and in a positive way with challenges. The second one, I've in a way tried to show it a little bit, to admit the complexity of history to a sound historical method. All the examples like to Rwanda, but also the Nazi regime, Ukraine, America today, the xenophobia. We could not have resolved the problem with simplistic ideas when they are the good and the bad guys. There's always complexities, social, cultural, political, socio-economical, religious actually. Because I didn't talk a lot about religion today. Religion can also lead to violence or resolve violence. It works both ways. And through that, the only way is the patient work of collecting sources, archival sources or oral sources, analyze them and come to some sort of conclusion. That's the work of the historian. It's the historical method. Lastly, and I've developed myself this idea to a certain project. I don't have the time to explain them all. It's what I call to narrow down differences in situation of conflict. In other words, when there's a conflict, there's a conflict. The opposition, different interests, and different histories, and different memories of violence. Yes, true. At the same time, you never a situation with everybody all the time about everything was in conflict. So there's other aspects. For example, the Hutu and Tutsi, an important thing to say, a lot of time they were not in conflict. They were actually exchanging beers together and getting married. There's a lot in them. So it's important to look, to say, okay, on this there's been a disagreement, but not on everything. It's an important principle. I call to narrow down and in a conflict resolution situation, the first thing to say is, what exactly do we disagree about? And you see, it could end up being fairly little in the end. You never thought about it. In fact, there are conflicts where the enemies, they agree on everything except on one thing. So let's narrow down and then deal with it and come to some sort of compromise. So I think I've more or less used my time the best I could. I would like to conclude to say that the theme is about hermeneutic, what do you call it? Hermeneutic, let me see. Hermeneutic changes in values and cultures. My input was to bring the historical dimension, the fact that a certain type of historical narrative can bring to different forms of violence, and it needs to be interpreted. That's the hermeneutical part. We need to look at it critically, step back, take distance, do all the things I've proposed here, and it could hopefully bring a world which is a little bit better. Thank you.